Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for what we are calling an intersectional conversation about inequity, social justice, and the climate crisis with none other than Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. I'm Renee Johnson. I'm the Senior Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at World Wildlife Fund, and I am joined by our President and CEO, Carter Roberts.
Thank you, Renee. This is an immensely important topic and one in which I know almost everyone in the audience today is working on addressing the issue of climate change and doing it in the right way. And it's worth remembering that among the 4 signature priorities of the Biden administration, one of them is climate change and the other one is racial justice. And it's not like we have a choice of choosing between the two. It is immensely important in pursuing solutions in a way that addresses the needs of the most marginalized communities and supports the work of individuals in the front lines and communities that we serve. So I'm going to say a little bit about our distinguished guest. I will say that Renee and I had a little bit of a tussle over who would do the introduction, and we decided to split the duty. So I'll say a bit, and then I know Renee is going to come in with the rest. Let's just say that Dr. Johnson has a glittering resume. She's a marine biologist, policy expert, writer, and a Brooklyn native. She's the founder of the Urban Ocean Lab, a think tank for coastal cities, who obviously are on the front lines of climate change. She's a co-creator and co-host of the Spotify Gimlet podcast, How to Save a Planet. With Dr. Catherine Wilkinson, she co-edited the anthology All We Can Save and co-founded the All We Can Save project. She recently co-authored the Blue New Deal, a roadmap for including the ocean and climate policy. She previously served as the executive director of the Wade Institute, developed policy at the EPA and NOAA, and in her spare time served as a leader of the March for Science and has taught as an adjunct professor at New York University. Over to you, Renee.
Yes, and Dr. Johnson earned a bachelor's degree from Harvard University in environmental science and public policy and a PhD from Scripps Institution of Oceanography in marine biology. She publishes widely, including in the New York Times, Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and Time. And she blogs on Scientific American. She was named one of ELLE's 27 women leading on climate, and Outside Magazine called her the most influential marine biologist of our time. Her mission is to build community around solutions for our climate crisis. And we're just so appreciative to have her joining us today.
Hi.
Hi, Ayana. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Well, you obviously do a lot with your time, so it's great to share that with everybody.
Listening to you introduce me.
Yes, it inspires me. It makes me want to do more. So all good. But thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate it. For those of you that are watching in our viewing audiences, either on Facebook or YouTube, we hope to have a few minutes at the end to take some questions. So please feel free to submit those on your various platforms. And with that, we will just jump right in. Ayana, why don't you start just telling us a little bit about your background and just your journey that got you into marine biology?
I think like most people who end up doing some sort of environment or conservation work, I had a remarkable experience in nature as a kid. In fact, a string of them. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and in a working class family, and we didn't really travel the world or go on lots of vacations. But when I was 5, we did go to Florida, and I learned to swim, and good luck getting me out of the pool, you know? I just was totally in love with the water and the beach, and started collecting shells on the beach and wanted to know all about what was living in the ocean. And I got to ride on a glass bottom boat and see a coral reef for the first time. And I was just like, excuse me, I have so many questions. What is happening down here? And I want to know all about it. And what is it called when it's your job to just do this? Is that a job? And and so that's when I decided to become a marine biologist. And I think, so many kids have that as a childhood dream. It's pretty common. A lot of people that I meet say, oh, I wanted to be a marine biologist when I was a kid. And for me, it's not something I would have stuck with if it were just the straight science, especially if it were only laboratory research. But it was this moment of realizing that ocean conservation more broadly, yes, you need to understand the science, but it's also about policy. It's about communities living along the coast and the justice and cultural issues there. It's this puzzle of science, economics, law, policy, culture, justice, and that is like lifetimes worth of work. So once I realized that I could help put the pieces of that puzzle together, I was like, all right, I'm in.
Awesome. Well, a part of this title is intersectionality, and you just epitomize all of the places where all of those things connect. So we're very excited to be able to talk about how they connect. Can you tell us just a little bit about what you're working on now? We'll talk about some of your other work too, but any exciting projects on the horizon?
There are some that are so exciting I'm not allowed to tell you yet because I've had to sign non-disclosure agreements, but stay tuned. As you generously introduced me, I spend a bunch of my time working on this podcast, How to Save a Planet, which is really about climate solutions and ways that we can all find our place in making them happen with the speed and scale that's required. And I think that's been something that the environmental movement, the climate movement hasn't really been great at, is going beyond the checklist for everybody, right? Like you should reduce your own carbon footprint, you should vote, you should donate, you should spread the word. And like, yes, please do those things. But also, what are the special skills we should each bring to the table? Like what I can do and what you can do to make the biggest impact in pushing for ending the climate crisis are completely different, right? Like you can change what's happening at world wildlife. I can't do that. I can, work on coastal cities policy. I can create this podcast. And so the show is really about solutions, not just detailing the problem, but how do we start to think about each finding our most important roles. And the book, All We Can Save, the anthology of essays from 40 women climate leaders, is the same thing, like looking at all these examples of ways that have made a really big impact as individuals, but like in collaboration. And that's where I've been devoting most of my energy right now, because the vast majority of Americans are like, yikes, climate is a massive problem and I want to help, but it just doesn't feel big enough to focus on individual actions anymore. And it's not. Like we're past the changing your light bulbs point of solution. So what does it look like to take each of our involvement to the next level, which to me is that Venn diagram of like, what are you actually good at? When people ask me, what can I do? I'm like, I don't know. What are you good at? If you're a farmer or a teacher or a lawyer or a doctor or an artist, like the answers are going to be different. What skills do you have? Which solutions do you want to work on? There are so many different climate solutions, right? From transportation, electricity, agriculture, land use, manufacturing, politics, all of it. And then like, what brings you joy? Like what gets you out of bed in the morning? And how can each of us sort of find our way to the epicenter of that Venn diagram? Whether that changes every few months or every year, what we work on, if it's a part-time thing or if it's our full-time job, that's fine. But that's kind of the way I've been encouraging people to think. And that's all of my projects are some version of pushing that forward.
Okay. That's awesome, because I agree. At some points, it can feel very daunting. The issues are so vast.
Yeah.
So I love that you're sort of focusing on the little bits, and that's awesome. You mentioned All We Can Save and
Mhm.
the book, and I love that sort of one of the objectives was to lift up a diverse cross section of women in that. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of how that book came to be? What was the impetus for starting that project?
So it's an anthology that I co-edited with Dr. Catherine Wilkinson.
Mhm.
And she and I were at a conference out in Colorado about 2 years ago now. And it was just like the same old thing. It was a bunch of older white men who controlled all the money and decided on the agenda and who got the microphones and who was listened to. And, you know, it was indigenous groups and young people of color who were sort of like paraded out as the entertainment, but not actually given a platform to share their ideas and
Mhm.
priorities. And it was so frustrating because A, it's offensive, but B, it means that we're going to lose. And we cannot
Mhm.
afford to lose, right? So much is at stake. And I think what people miss when we talk about intersectionality and diversity is it's not optional. Like, if we leave out people of color, we will not be successful in addressing the climate crisis. And we can get into more of that later, but for the purposes of the book, Catherine and I at this moment, we were very new colleagues, and we were both like, get me out of this mess of a conference. So
Mhm.
we went for a hike in the woods, and we were like, how do we start to fix this? How do we start to make the shift away from the current status quo, which is not going to get us where we need to be, to a
Mhm.
scenario where we're listening to a broad cross section of experts who can actually collectively solve the problems? Because what we need is not just different leaders, we need
Mhm.
more leaders, right? We need
Right.
leaders in every single community leading their communities in this transformation of, of energy and transportation and buildings and manufacturing and food and all of it. And so we just need
Mhm.
so many more voices and perspectives. And so the anthology came to mind for us as one way we could say, this is a whole chorus of voices that y'all have been missing. These are all our
Mm.
homegirls who were not invited to this conference, and we're going to put everyone's insights into one book. These are people who are not going to stop doing their work to write an entire book of their own, but we can help collect that and
Mhm.
offer it to the world. And of course, publishers were like, no one wants to buy this book. And they were wrong. It became a bestseller. So if you haven't already gotten a copy, other people seem to like it. Um, and it's been really gratifying to see, because anthologies typically don't sell well because we live in the US in this cult of the individual. And
Yeah.
so, what makes me really pleased about the book becoming a bestseller is that that is an endorsement of the understanding that it's going to take so many different people and perspectives
Mhm.
and areas of expertise and approaches to solve this problem. Not one book written by a single person, even if you're Bill Gates, is actually going to
Mhm.
have answers to the climate crisis, right? His book doesn't talk about policy, which is obviously a really big part of how we get where we
Mhm.
need to go. Like, technology is not enough. So um, we have Catherine and I have launched a nonprofit that carries forward the work of the book, which is primarily to support women who are leading on climate and this idea of nurturing a feminist climate renaissance, not like an uprising or a rebellion, but like a rebirth of thinking about what is our role with respect to the rest of life on this planet, and how do we collectively find our way to the transformations that we need.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was going to ask, first of all, love your shirt, climate feminist.
Thank you.
um, but I was going to ask about that term. I was really intrigued by it in the book, feminist climate renaissance, and what that
Yeah.
means, and what is the role of men in
Mm-hmm.
that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, first of all, the term we coined the term because we were filling out a form for a grant to support a gathering of women as a retreat, women leading on climate. We thought, like, if a lot of these women got to know each other, then all these beautiful ripples would emerge, right? All these collaborations and partnerships and new projects. And so we had to fill out this form for this retreat funding grant. And so we had to make a name for the gathering. And so we called it the Feminist Climate Renaissance, which was sort of a ridiculous joke at the time, but it became this dream. Like, what if we could have a climate movement where gender equality was part of it? And I feel always compelled to say, being a feminist means that you believe in gender equality. And so anyone of any gender can therefore be a feminist.
That's right.
And so to answer your follow-up question, that means men are certainly welcome. In fact, we're going to need all the people on the planet to feel welcome, and bringing their skills to the table, but recognizing the importance of women in particular, because women have been left out of leadership roles in so many settings. And quantitatively, the social science research shows that when women have an equal seat at the table, whether that's, members of parliament or in boardrooms, the outcomes for the environment are simply better. We have stronger environmental laws. Those laws are more strongly enforced. We end up creating more protected areas. The lead negotiators for the Paris Agreement, women, right? Like, when we have women in leadership roles, we actually have better outcomes for the planet. And I think that we often think about race and gender and class and all these forms of diversity as optional, as like the nice thing to do. We do not think about strategically, like, this is the winning move, right? When we don't like deliberately welcome Black Americans into climate work, we're leaving 23 million Americans out of the solution. That is the approximate number of Black Americans who already care and are concerned about the climate crisis. And that's one of the reasons we need to like deal with racism, because imagine lifting the burden of racism off 23 million people who want to help and now suddenly can engage in other things instead of worrying about, their rights to live and breathe day to day.
Yeah, so really interesting. And I want to delve into that a little bit more. So as we think about, I heard you say in a video, I think last year, that our inequality crisis is intertwined with the climate crisis. And I think that's a little bit of what you're getting at here. But I'd love to just hear you talk a little bit more about that and what you think the implications of that would be.
Yeah. So in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and sort of and the deluge of high profile police murders that happened last summer, last summer, and the innumerable continuations of that we don't hear about, it hit me so hard. And I am a person who has what I call robot mode. Like, I just make a to-do list and I'm like, boom, 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 let's get it done. Like, my gratification is in like completing tasks and like getting things done in the world and productivity. Like, I actually will feel better. This is twisted. Like, if I like check more things off my to-do list than if I like relax and watch a movie. Like, it will bring me more joy because I'll like, it's done. I should probably watch more movies because I'm like so out of touch with like pop culture references. So I think in that moment, it was one of the first times in my life I couldn't just keep working. Like, I was so torn apart that I couldn't just get my normal productivity going. And so I stopped everything, and I was really grateful for Catherine Wilkinson, my partner on All We Can Save, and Alex Bloomberg and the team at the podcast, who really picked up the slack for me for a week or two. And so the line that you're quoting is from an op-ed that I published at that time, where I was processing my thoughts about this. And I basically wrote it as a letter to white environmentalists, which was like, we need you. We need you to understand that this crisis of racial injustice is intertwined with the climate crisis because of people like me, right? Like, I wake up every day as a Black person. I don't get to decide to not care about that. Like, it's just who I am. I wake up every day as a woman. I wake up every day as a marine biologist. I wake up every day as a girl from Brooklyn, right? I wake up every day as the daughter of a farmer. And so when we talk about intersectionality, it's the fact that all of those parts of our being, all of those identities are just there, all in one body, right? And what does that mean for my ability, for your ability, for anyone's ability to get the work done? We bring a different and important perspective because of not one of our identities, but our collective wisdom because of our lifetime of experiences. And it means that we're affected by other things that happen in the world. And so what I realized last summer was how much of a loss it is when we have to deal with racism and sexism or xenophobia or homophobia or whatever the things are that gets in the way of doing the work. Like, I would much rather just be a total dork and working on ocean policy and never talk about race again. But that's not a choice for me. Like, because I don't get to erase that part of who I am, and I don't get to erase that part of the way people see me, or how it affects the people I love, or, you know, or how it affects what we have to see in the news and somehow metabolize and then somehow keep showing up at work. And so it really is just slowing us down. All of these inequities just slow us down from saving the planet, to put it oversimplified way. And the numbers there that really stuck out to me were this polling data from Yale and George Mason universities that showed that in the US, I know this is a global organization, WWF, and your audiences, but bear with me for the moment, because the US is the largest contributor historically to the climate crisis, and we have arguably the most work to do. So it actually does really matter that, like, we get our act together here. And so I was reading this polling data, and it said that that it's 39% of white Americans who are deeply concerned 49% of white Americans who are concerned about the climate crisis, compared to 57% of Black Americans and 69% of Latino Americans. And so when you think about what that means, to burden Black and Latinx people with racism, and to burden women who are also Black or Latino additionally with sexism, and to burden queer or immigrant people who are also Black or Latino also with all of these things, how are we supposed to offer our, like, highest and best contributions, even if we are the demographics who care 10 or 20 percentage points more about the situation that we're in? And the reason in particular that the Latinx community cares more about the climate crisis is not what people expect. People expect it's because they're hit the hardest by the impacts, whether that's farm workers or people dealing with, you know, heat waves and droughts, or it's coastal communities dealing with floods and sea level rise. It's actually because that demographic has a much more egalitarian worldview. They have an understanding that we're all in this together, a
Yeah.
responsibility to each other, a responsibility to do your part. And if we can spread that mindset across all people, we'll get a lot further. So I think we spend a lot of time talking about who's hit hardest by climate change, and that is absolutely a justice issue. Like, we need to address that. But we spend far too little time talking about racial equity in who is creating and moving forward the solutions, because that's what's going to determine the future, not just fixing systemic injustices of the past, but deciding who is shaping the future. And I think if we want to build the biggest, strongest team, which is what we need to solve the biggest challenge humanity has ever faced, then we need to get it together and start welcoming people in and addressing all of these other systemic injustices to unburden people so they can contribute more fully to addressing the climate crisis.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. I do want to just very quickly remind folks that are viewing to feel free to submit your questions, and we'll do our best to take those at the end. Okay, so just to continue a little bit on this line of thinking, I read an editorial last year in which you quoted a portion of a speech from Toni Morrison from about 1975. And in that, the quote was essentially that the very serious function of racism is distraction. And that it keeps you from doing your work, exactly what you said. And it keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being.
Yeah.
I would love to understand, like, how has that played out in your life personally? Just, or has it? And maybe it hasn't, but just this idea of distracting us from kind of the main thing. How has that shown up for you?
Ironically, and this is probably indelicate of me to say, it's the fact that I spend so much of my time having conversations like this, right?
Yeah.
Since last summer, most of what people want to talk to me about is racial injustice and how do we do it better. And although I have feelings and opinions and some minor insights, it's not my area of expertise, right? Like, I went to graduate school and got a PhD in marine biology and policy. I founded a think tank for the future of coastal cities. Like, that's what I want to be talking about. I co-founded a nonprofit to support women leading on climate. Like, that's what I want to be talking about. And so because America and the world doesn't have its act together on race, I find myself spending a lot of time talking about race when I think, like, imagine if racism didn't exist and what we could spend this hour dreaming of together, right? Dreaming of what the world would look like if we charged ahead with climate solutions and what we are working for instead of running from. And all of these solutions that we have at our fingertips that we just need to figure out, like, who's doing what and how fast can we do it, because, like, we're running out of time. But we can't, unfortunately, run full speed at climate solutions when there's these, like, barriers in the way for so many people. And for so long, I have a lot of friends who have committed their lives to the work for racial justice. And there were moments where I was like, y'all, like, we need to save the planet. Like, we are out of time. Like, come join me over here. And I just didn't totally get how fundamental their work was to mine. Right? I didn't understand that if we have mass incarceration, where in some neighborhoods of cities you have some insane percentage of people who are in jail at any one point in time, how are we expecting people from that community to to focus on climate, when they're worried about their loved ones' safety, when they're worried about their loved ones' futures, for like people who are in jail for a decade because they had marijuana on them once, right? Like how, and then come out and are trying to figure out a job and housing and how to take care of their families and all these things. And we've like created all these systems that are a total mess, and people need to focus on their day-to-day health and well-being of the people around them. So you don't have the chance to zoom out and say, like, how do we effectively make a better world? Because you can't do everything at the same time. Everyone has the same number of minutes in the day. So that hit me really hard, and I have just such immense gratitude for people doing that foundational work towards equity and justice, because if we don't do that at the same time, we just won't be able fast enough.
Yeah, that's great. I wonder if it's sort of like, the hierarchy of needs, right? There's some basic needs, just basic survival that needs to be addressed before you can fully expect, full engagement on, not that the other needs are less important, but there's sort of an immediacy that impacts, just people's ability to focus, is what it sounds like I'm hearing.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
And people who would love to have a career in climate science or ocean science or environmental policy, but feel like the most urgent thing for them to use their talents on is dealing with racial profiling in our police system, or divesting from violent policing and investing in other forms of community well-being. Like if people are choosing where to use their talents, you can see how people would feel like, okay, let me deal with some of this other stuff first. But that said, we have generations of a strong legacy of people of color leading on environmental work. I don't want to sell that short. A lot of people have made that choice. A lot of that work has gone unrecognized, unfunded, underfunded. People who are working in their communities to clean up pollution, to prevent pollution, to address air quality issues and chemical spills and drinking water. There are so many people of color doing this work, but it's often like a side hustle or their volunteer work, because there just aren't the supports for environmental justice work in small communities or in communities of color of any size, because they don't have the capacity to write fancy grants, right? They don't have a 501c3 nonprofit set up. And so figuring out how large groups like WWF can be partnering with local leaders and local groups who have trouble getting the resources or developing their strategy. And I think what's most important is learning from each other as far as what's working in other places, right? Like when people in each community are like, oh God, an oil spill, what do we do? They're not the first who've had to deal with that. They're not the first to deal with a pipeline. They're not the first to deal with a plastic manufacturing plant or drinking water crisis. And so the extent to which larger organizations can help spread these lessons learned to all the communities that are dealing with the same challenges, I think that would be really helpful, because there's not enough time for everyone to figure it out for themselves. We really need some of that larger structure and connecting the dots, and these local leaders being really deeply networked.
Yeah, that's really great. I'm going to take a brief pause here for a minute, because there is a question from the audience that really relates to what you were just saying. So I want to just introduce that now. and I'll read it to make sure I get it right. What do you hope to see from large organizations like WWF in the space of climate and social justice, especially in respect to all of these inequities? So you talked about a couple of them, right, just a minute ago, but other things that come to mind that organizations like us can be doing?
I think just put your money where your mouth is, right? Like we're at the stage where any large organization realizes they gotta talk differently. You gotta talk about this stuff. You have to care about this stuff. It's no longer optional. I mean, last summer was the moment when large environmental groups actually started talking about racial justice for the first time, a lot
Yeah.
of them in a deep way. And that was an important step.
Mm-hmm.
But it is the first step, right? Like, oh no, there's a big problem. We are aware of this problem. We would like to help solve this problem. Great. But then you have this sort of oversimplification, which is the language that I was starting to see, which is climate justice is racial justice with like an equal sign in between. And I think that that's a disservice because there are a lot of climate issues that actually don't have to do with race. And there are a lot of justice issues that don't have to do with climate. And so while it's like overlapping Venn diagram, like let's not oversimplify the problem such that it's not even accurate enough that it's helping us solve it. So I think large environmental groups can help add nuance to the national and international conversation about where their work specifically fits in. I think to the extent that large environmental groups can acknowledge their things that they would do differently now, if you had it to do over again, I think that's really helpful to be really specific about having learned from the past and learned from this inflection point in history. Because if we just pretend we were all doing it perfect before, then why would we have to change anything, right? So like, let's acknowledge, like, you know, now that we know better, we're going to do better. But like, here's some of the stuff we would have done better if we had known then. I think that's an important step in the process. Organizations like the Sierra Club have really tried to be explicit about sort of their founders and the racial injustices perpetuated by in sort of like the foundational moments of their organization. And I think put your money where your mouth is, right? Like, I forget who said it, but this quote of show me your budget and I'll show you your priorities.
Yeah.
Like, if you care this much, but you have all the same people as were making mistakes in the past, and you're allocating your internal resources in exactly the same way, then why would we expect anything to change, right? Like, you have to change the way that you work and you have to evolve your teams if you're going to do the work differently. It's not just about diversity trainings. It's about diversity in all senses of the word, right? Race, class, gender, ethnicity, religion, geography, education. Like, how do we bring together truly diverse teams to solve really hard problems? And I think we like to skip that part. Like, you might need some different people. You might need to promote some people who you have not valued their skills appropriately before. You might need to like not have, I don't know how your office is structured, but often in a lot of these large organizations, the diversity, equity, and inclusion office doesn't actually have enough authority or a big enough budget to do the work that needs to be done. So it's just like, great, we've got this office and we've got a Black woman leading it, but we haven't actually given her the authority to do what needs to be done. And I think that I've seen happen, you know, a gazillion times. So thinking about what it really means to shift power. Who is making the decisions around hiring, around strategy, around budget? If those are all the same people, then nothing has changed. And I think we just need to have a lot of conversations about power, because that's what Catherine and I saw at that conference that led us to walk out and go into the woods and come up with the idea for this book and this nonprofit. Because like what we were seeing was that the power was in the wrong hands. And we need to spread that around in a substantial way. So I think to the extent that large organizations can be transparent about their process of transformation, that's really helpful, because coming out with a big statement in 2020 and then in 2022 being like, we did it, what does that mean? What happened? Like, show us the journey, because then A, we'll believe you, and B, like, there's so much to be learned in the process. Like, let's acknowledge that this is all trial and error and that it's iterative, but that we're committed to getting it right. And I think the assumption that we're all going to like, oh shoot, racial injustice is a problem, like we'll just stop doing the bad stuff and we'll just do the good stuff, like that's oversimplified. It's a process of transformation. So I think in the same way that like corporate sustainability is a process of transformation, and I think corporations need to be talking about their process, not just like, we set this goal for carbon emissions and then we reached it. Like, that doesn't help anyone. Like, how did you get there? How hard was it? What were the really challenging things? How did you have to shift your manufacturing? How did you have to shift distribution and shipping and all of these things? Like, that's the interesting part. This is a great question, and I hope I didn't cause too much trouble with my answer.
No, I think the answer was great. I'm glad that you talked about just the iterative nature of the process, because I do think oftentimes, especially for people who very clearly see the problem and see the connectedness of issues, it feels like it should be just flip a switch and we're done. We just don't do that anymore, or whatever that is. And one of the things that I do appreciate, one of the many, for the journey that we are on is, like many organizations, last year was a bit of an awakening as it related to the connectedness of these issues, and sort of the responsibility to do what we can do, which we think is probably a lot. But I think the challenge is, okay, what is that, right? And so we're sort of on a learning journey, if you will, so that we are and taking other people along with us, right? That's why having an event like this and having it open to the public, so that those that are supporters of our organization and that kind of walk this journey with us, that we're kind of all going through and broadening our awareness together. And then the trial and error piece, right, is just critical for this work, because what works over here in this organization might not work over here. And I think the more we share those things, and then you can kind of take nuggets from here and take nuggets from here and nuggets from here, to your point, then you really shape something that is relevant for where your organization is. Because we're not all, the key point of when you think about equity work is recognizing that we don't all have the same starting place, right? So we're not all at the same place. And so our journey will look a little bit different, but I appreciate definitely your answer, and especially the focus on sharing the journey, which can feel very vulnerable, because you're sharing the highs and the lows. But to your point, that is kind of it's authentic and it's transparent, but it's also it gives other people nuggets to take from it. So appreciate it.
I'd love to hear from you, Renee, sadly not related to me, Johnson. I'm sure other people watching are curious too. Are there things that you can share that you've identified as major opportunities for WWF to use, your largeness as an organization and your resources to really spark some change?
Yeah, so there are a number of things that we are focused on today. Some of them have to do with the basic blocking and tackling, right? It's looking at our workforce for sure, looking at the diverse mix of that workforce, and not just identifying where there's underrepresentation, but sort of putting a stake in the ground and putting a goal that says, this is what we're aiming for, and here are the things that we're going to do to try to enable the organization to meet that goal as it relates to both, attraction, promotion, retention, etc. But it's recognizing that, the mix is so important. As an organization, we are predominantly female, so we're almost 70% female. But race is the area that is sort of the top priority because that's where we feel like we have the most opportunity and to drive progress. So a lot of it is around education. So focusing on developing an anti-racism education series, looking at also environmental justice, particularly in the US, because as you said, we are an international organization and we do work, all over the world, but where we see, again, the biggest opportunity is kind of in what's happening in the US. And that may not mean a change in our programmatic work. It might. We're figuring that out, but it definitely can mean a change in elevating voices such as yourself that we feel like have key messages to deliver that help all of us, and looking at organizations that perhaps don't have that have been on this journey, say around environmental justice. We haven't extensively been a player in that market. So how do we elevate others that have been? How do we find out sort of who they are? But then how do we come alongside them? And you talked earlier about smaller organizations that maybe don't have someone that can write a great grant proposal or whatever the case may be, but we do. So we have lots of expertise, lots of resources. So those are the kinds of things in this space. Another big one for me personally, this is not going to be the same for you because you knew at the age of 5 that this is work you wanted to do. But my story is very different from that. My story is, now granted, I'm not a scientist, but I was one of those people that said, like, do Black people really do that? Like, I don't know. And so I think there is also an opportunity to help show to people like me who grew up like me. I didn't grow up in the outdoors, really. A city girl like you, but the nature was not a big part of my upbringing. So I am still learning a lot of that now, and I think there are lots of other people who, if they were exposed more broadly, would understand a bit more about things that they can do and roles that they can play. Doesn't have to be a day job or anything like that, but just to help drive progress in the areas of climate and just conservation more broadly. So a lot of it's around education, educating ourselves, making sure that we acknowledge that we are not the experts on everything. and, taking time to learn, and then figure out how we can further kind of that good work that's already going on.
Yeah,
So
that's
we kind of
great.
have this model of listen, learn, act. Listen, learn, act. Listen,
Yeah,
figure out what it is we need to take away, and then what do we do? So
yeah.
that's a little bit of the kind of approach that we're taking.
Thank you for sharing that. There's one particular thing that I learned a few years ago around um, diversifying the environmental field more broadly, which is it all starts with internships, right? Like, what's your first job? And how do you then like use that to build your resume, build your network, start to learn, is this really where I fit? Actually, maybe I'll just go slightly this direction. But for so long, so many of the internships were unpaid. And so
Yep.
only people who already had money and parents who could support them could even
Yep.
afford to take an internship like that. Like there were things I couldn't afford to do because I couldn't afford to not make money all summer
Right.
in college. So I think on a like very boring practical note, if everyone just paid their interns a living wage, then that would help get a broader diversity of applicants, which would lead to a
Yeah.
broader diversity of,
Absolutely.
qualified
Absolutely.
candidates, which would lead to a broader diversity of people getting their first step, their foot in the door into
Yeah.
these environmental organizations. And then, all the work that happens with making sure they actually feel welcome and appreciated once they're in there. So they don't
Yeah.
run away being like, place is horrible and racist. How
Yeah.
fast can I leave?
Yeah. You're exactly right.
Pay your
And that's
interns.
something. Yeah. I mean, that's something that we're looking at for exactly the same reasons that you mentioned, right? A lot of the internships in this space are unpaid. Not all. We have paid interns, but some of them are unpaid, and recognizing that can be a barrier, not just for students who can't afford to not earn income. I use this as an example. I use my daughter as an example. She's a graduating senior from Tuskegee University, biology major, pre-vet. And and while I would say she can afford to take an internship with no pay, she doesn't want to. She feels like there are options, and why would I choose that? So
Yeah.
um, it is certainly for those that are not in a position for various reasons. Maybe they're putting themselves through school, it could be anything, right? But it's also just having the broadest reach possible to attract the best talent possible
Yeah.
and begin to shape that pipeline for the future, whether that pipeline's for WWF or not, but ideally in conservation in this
Yeah.
space. And, the way that we're thinking about it, because we do have, certainly undergrad and graduate level interns, but we're trying to think about it at that undergrad level so that it's early enough that it can actually shape what they envision for their future, particularly
Mm-hmm.
if they're going to grad school. So we're designing our program to focus on the undergrad level, paid, um, diverse students, diverse pool of students, and hoping to give them a broad exposure to what is the art of possible. I mean, what you said at 5, 6 was so important. Like, give them a vision of like, that could be a day job. That's a job. I could do
And you
that.
can make a good living at it if you get past
Yeah.
the intern
I'm sorry. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly
Yeah.
right. Um,
Yeah. I think, just one last thing on that point. When you have, for a lot of families, your first generation going to college or to graduate school, and you're expected to then give back to your family and community. If you don't feel like you can make a decent living doing conservation work, it almost starts to feel selfish. If I can't take care of my parents, with this job, maybe I should go into investment banking, right? A lot of people I know made that decision. Like, if I'm the first Black kid to leave Brooklyn and, from my block and go to Harvard, who am I to just be like, I'm going to go hang out with like parrotfish in the Caribbean for the rest of my life? Like, no, I have to figure out how to give back, right? And so making sure we eliminate that false choice, right? Like you can actually, do well for yourself and your family and your community while doing good, I think is really important, because a lot of young people I talk to don't know how much executives make at large environmental nonprofits, that everyone's making like into the six figures and you actually make a very good salary doing this work. And that, like, people's eyes pop open. They're like, what? I don't have to sell out to be able to one day afford to buy a house, right? And so I think it's important to be like super blunt about the practicalities of doing this work. Like you can have great healthcare and a good salary and still be working on climate solutions every day.
Yeah, really, really great. Well, there are a number of questions that are coming in. There was one about focusing on kind of the individual that I did want to try to get to.
Yeah.
I know we're just about out of time. What can we as individuals do and say when we encounter people who still don't see the connections between racial justice and conservation action and policy? We'll end on that question.
So I have a similar reaction to this as I do when it's a question about people who are climate science deniers. And step one is like, is this your battle to fight? Because, something like 85-90% of Americans understand that climate change is happening and we need to do something about it. So I like to focus most of my attention on the 90% of people who are like, what are we going to do? I don't want to waste all of my time on the other 10% who I probably don't have the energy or time or interest in convincing, who often just want to argue for the sake of playing the devil's advocate. And like we all know, the devil doesn't need any more advocates. So please stop doing that, especially if you're a white man. Just don't be the devil's advocate. And so I think the first question is like, do you want to have that conversation with this person? Is this an antagonistic scenario where someone wants to like debate you about whether race matters? Because like there's enough challenges in the world. We don't need to go banging our heads against the wall. I think of my energy and minutes and patience as finite. And so what do I want to do with those? So step one, like, is this someone you even want to engage with on that? Because you don't have to do that with everybody. If it's a person in your family, if it's a person you care about, if it's a person in your workplace who you really need to help them understand, like that, like, but understand it's an investment in that person or that relationship that you're making, and you don't have to invest in every single one. And for me, that op-ed that I wrote last year was my explanation of that. Like, these are the reasons that I can't offer my best contributions to climate work. Race is one of those. Gender is one of those, because those things, the way that people see me, react to me, the ways in which I am like bombarded with racism and sexism in the world, just are annoying, and they slow me down. And I'm lucky that they're just annoying and slow me down and are not actually killing me as they do other people. So I think figuring out what is your place of personal experience from which you can comfortably speak is really valuable. I need to be honest at the same time about my privilege, right? Like, I have a very fancy resume. I've had doors fly open for me. You know, I've done a ton of work, but it's all sort of lined up now that people realize they need to listen to women and Black people and scientists. Everyone wants to hang out with me. But that's, you know, that's this opportunity to say like, okay, well, if now you're ready to listen, I guess now's the time when I should talk, even if the truth is I'm just a weird introvert who wants to like read books on my sofa. So I think figure out like what is what do you specifically have to bring to that conversation? Because often it's not about facts. It helps sometimes to have numbers that you can mention. But when people are coming to you with these questions, sometimes it's not genuine. They don't actually want to have a reasonable discourse. Two, they don't actually want to debate numbers. They want to understand like where you're coming from. And three, more often than not, they want you to understand where they're coming from. And so I would sort of flip it on its head and say, like, tell me why you don't think this is a problem. Tell me why this is something you want to talk about. Like, what are you seeing? Because you can't change someone's mind unless you know what they're actually thinking, unless you can get to the core of like how they came up with their worldview. Because you may have a completely different understanding of the problem, and so a completely different understanding of the solution, and therefore a completely different understanding of what the effective argument or talking points might be. So as much as it sounds counterintuitive, I think the first step in those scenarios, if you've decided this is a person you want to invest in having these conversations with, and conversations plural is what it will take. You're not going to change someone's worldview in 10 minutes.
Right.
Think about like how you can use that as a moment to listen and actually understand where they're coming from before you just try to like throw a lot of facts and get upset and be like, don't you see? Because if they are trying to see, there's a reason why they haven't so far. If this is a good, well-meaning person that has blinders on for some reason, what is the source of those blinders? And so I think that's where we often expect people who don't get the intersections of race and climate and justice, we often expect them to listen to us. But I think more often, if we want to be effective in changing their perspectives, we need to like very much ask questions and listen as our starting point.
Yeah,
but
that's
it's
so
work.
great. Yeah, it is. It is. Thank you so much. I cannot tell you how much I've enjoyed this conversation. So thank you for spending the time with us. It was certainly a pleasure, and for sharing your thoughts, your perspective, and also calling us all to action, which is also just as important.
There's work to do.
Yes, there is work to do. And thank you also to our viewing audiences that joined us today. Appreciate you taking your time. I do want to say, if you would like to find Dr. Johnson on social media, you can find her on Instagram or Twitter at, that's right, here, you can find her here. So her handle is there. And again, just thank you all. And then last but certainly not least, I do want to say thank you to our production team that supported this event today. Couldn't do it without you. So thank you all, and hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Thanks a lot.